Okay, we're up and running. Thought it wasn't going to work because it's, you know, so cold here. It's 60 degrees. Computer was saying, it's too cold. I can't get my atoms moving. Although they say computers work better when it's cold. So good morning, afternoon, everyone. It is time to begin a new book, to begin the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Leviticus gets a bad rap because a lot of people look at Leviticus and they see the sacrifices and the various purity laws, and they check out. They say, just skip pages until I get back into the story, or skip pages until I get to the good laws. And I'd like to see if we can't, to some degree, reclaim the understanding of the sacrifices and all of that, because they're kind of important in the Torah. And if they're kind of important in the Torah, we should probably look to see what they can teach us. Doesn't mean we're going to run out and start up sacrificing tomorrow. We can't for a whole host of reasons. But we should still, at least when we're mentioning them, when we're reading about them, be able to gather and glean a great deal of wisdom. So we're going to begin with the beginning of Vayikra, beginning of Leviticus 585, right there, chapter 1 of Leviticus, verse 1. And let's see what we can do. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about why we're starting, where we're starting anyway.
The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meetings, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to the Lord, he shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in his behalf before the Lord. He shall lay his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, that it may be acceptable in his behalf, in expiation for him. The bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into sections. The sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and lay out wood upon the fire. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall lay out the sections with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. Its entrails and legs shall be washed with water, and the priest shall turn the whole into smoke on the altar as a burnt offering, a pleasing odor, a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord."
All right. Why was this sacrifice offered?
It's expiation for some kind of sin, I suppose.
Is it?
Expiation.
No. All right. So it says expiation. We're going to have to unpack that. But where does it say the purpose of this sacrifice? Which, by the way, this is called an olah. This is this particular category of sacrifice is known as an olah. Where does it say when we have to bring it? That's usually a good way to figure out what the sacrifice is for, is if we know the timing of the sacrifice. You know, if you commit this sin, you bring the sacrifice. If it's this holiday, you bring the sacrifice. What is the timing condition for the sacrifice?
I don't think there's a timing condition, but the only thing I can think of is, this is what the Israelite people saw in Egypt as a way to dealing with their gods over there. This is what they know, is you slaughter animals. Sometimes you slaughter people, virgins for the field. And I think this is God sort of leading them along the path to the point at which they won't need to slaughter anymore. But for now, this is what they know.
So that is an interpretation of Rambam, right?
But it's also a reenactment of the covenant of the powers of Abraham.
And we've seen, however,
we've seen this show before.
That if we back up before Egypt, we see sacrifices going back a lot further than just Egypt. So this isn't something necessarily that we learned while we were in Egypt. We definitely had it reinforced because they had a sacrificial service as well.
This is all people knew then.
But for this particular sacrifice, the very first one that God chooses to have at the beginning of a book that's full of sacrifices, when am I bringing this?
It's a burnt offering.
Mm-hmm. Verse 3, right? Im olah, right? If a burnt offering is offered.
But when? Is this Pesach? Is this when you did something?
This is an everyday thing.
This is not a tamid. This is not one of the communal obligation sacrifices.
It's
Yes,
To
Lord.
draw
It's-
near, the process of drawing near to God in this process.
Well, all
I keep on
sacrifices
thinking-
have
I keep
that,
on thinking of Abraham, because
Right.
it just screams out to me,
right?
oh, I've
But
seen
there
this
are
movie before, this is,
But there are different sacrifices, right? There's a sacrifice for a holiday. There's a sacrifice
Right.
for a sin. There's a sacrifice when you give birth. There's a sacrifice when you are coming out the other side of sara'at, the skin condition. There are sacrifices always linked to many other things. What is this sacrifice linked to? Yeah.
Is it, there were several places where the people sinned
Mhm.
unintentionally, and when they
Right.
realized what they had done,
Right. A chatat offering, a sin offering, absolutely. But this isn't one of those.
Is this
Right.
actually, is this perhaps an explanation of how we will do the sin offerings when the time comes?
Nope. Nope. They get their own explanation.
There you go.
This is a free will offering.
a Thanksgiving
Gift
offering.
of pleasing.
Right? This is just when you feel like it.
Wow.
I know. Like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
A sacrifice when I feel like it?
When am I gonna feel like killing one of my bulls anyway?
Well, that's like giving tzedakah when you feel
Yeah.
like, or giving money to the shul.
Oh.
Right. When do you feel like writing a $100 check to a congregation? Right? Is that only when you've done something wrong? Is it only when it's a yard site or when it's a holiday or when you're, saying, for some other particular reason? Or maybe it's just because, you know what? Thanks for being here. Or I feel especially good because of what just happened between you and me, and I want to show my appreciation, right? The olah is the first sacrifice listed here, is the least obligatory sacrifice in the entire book. Well, actually, the first three here are all free will offerings. None of them have a requirement for when you need to do it, only a requirement for how you do it, which is really kind of underscoring what Vayikra is about. Vayikra is about us being able to choose to draw close to God through this vehicle of the ritual usage of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle with the altar and everything else. But that should be primarily a voluntary action. Yes, there are definitely ways that we need to do it when we've made mistakes. And yes, there are definitely ways that we do it in order to commemorate each day and each holiday. But what should come to mind first when we think about sacrifices should be, I just want to say, woohoo. Right? I just want to say thank you. I want to say I appreciate. I want to say I want to be closer. That should be the first thing we think of when we say sacrifice. Unfortunately, the English word sacrifice don't mean that. Right? The English word sacrifice almost always has a connotation of loss. And therefore, why would I ever lose something? A better word would be the word that was already thrown around, donation. Right? You are making a contribution when you do a korban, when you're doing a sacrifice. Rather than losing, you are gaining something through this process. And that's what we're learning just by the very structure of Vayikra and giving us this as our first model of a sacrifice, rather than the other sacrifices, which have much more clear-cut rules of when they need to be done. Make sense? Good. Now, the reason I wrote the word expiation up on the board is because I didn't want to forget to come back to it. Because this word's going to come up a lot when we're talking about sacrifices. And in Hebrew, the word, of course, is not expiation. In Hebrew, the word is kapara. Kapara.
Yeah.
Kapara may sound familiar, right?
In Yiddish, it's a kapura,
Yeah, which is?
something that's been worth nothing because it's being sacrificed. Not talking about kapura means it's not worth anything because you're going to kill it.
Interesting. I didn't know that Yiddish usage.
Yeah.
Right. So another word, atonement. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in the modern world, there is still a custom which the Shulchan Aruch calls silly. Yet people still do, called kaporet, where they will wave a chicken over someone's head. But let's go back to what the actual English words are, because they're not helpful. Right? But that's what our translation gives us. Right. So we have the word expiation, we have the word atonement. In English, those are always something that is when there's been a mistake, right? Which is why immediately, Harry, when I asked you what this is for, you jumped to atonement, sin offering, because it says expiation. I'm only doing expiation in English if I need expiation because of something. At least that's the general usage of the English word expiation. And atonement, all the more so, comes through, that's what we talk about in Yom Kippur. We're atoning for our sins. Kapara does not fit neatly into these English words. It absolutely can be used in a sense to make atonement. There's nothing wrong with that. But the root of the word comes from the root to be both rub on and rub off, or as they said in the old days of Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. It is a smearing process based off the core root word, but it has something to do with either removing or to cover. The same root word for kapara is used when we talk most famously in odd sentences for Noah when he's building the ark. When he is covering the inside with pitch in order to make it watertight, it's based off the same root. He's not atoning with pitch, to make it watertight. He's not making expiation. He's smearing it. He's rubbing it. And there seems to be some linguistic link within the mind of the ancients that does not fit neatly into our English categories, that kapara is how you somehow smooth out that connection. Sometimes it means smoothing away the blockage. Sometimes it means smoothing in the holes and filling them up so that it's a smooth surface. And that's what they mean when they say expiation. Well, that's what this translation means when it uses the word expiation, because that's the word kapara. So this will smooth things out between you and God. Might be a slightly more colloquial term, but it's one that is both positive. That is to say, it can be, like I said, there's a gap between me and God just because, I want to close that in, not because it's wrong, just because there's a gap. And, because I'm not as close to God as I could be. So I want to smooth that in a little bit. Or there could be a bump between me and God because I've done something wrong and I want to smooth that down so that it's better again. And the same word is used for both in the Hebrew, unlike in English. And hopefully, if we keep that in mind, it'll be a little bit less confusing. Okay? So, primary thing we're looking at here then is the first sacrifice we meet, actually the first three sacrifices we meet are all what we as moderns would probably consider positive sacrifices. Thank you, celebratory, woohoo, this is great time to be alive kind of celebratory sacrifices. Maybe I'll just use the word korban or korbanot, which is the Hebrew word, just because the English word sacrifice just still hangs so heavy in a downward sort of direction. All right. So sacrifices, korbanot, are good. But what are we supposed to get from them more fully than that? Well, let's take a look at what our texts have already said about this in other contexts, and then what our commentators have tried to help us understand. So first, we're going to start all the way back in Genesis 4 with the very first example of human beings trying to connect to God without having already been made that way. Right? We've got Adam and Chava, the first two human beings, and they got a sort of special relationship that was jump-started with having been made. But then we have the children that they have, Cain and Abel, who are made by their parents rather than by God, and they seem to want to connect to God the way mom and dad did. And so they bring sacrifices.
And it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought of the firstlings of his flock. And the Lord had respect to Abel and to his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had not respect.
Okay.
You know?
What's that?
He had no respect, maybe? He didn't have respect. He had none.
He had not respect. Well, don't worry about the English too much. Close enough, exactly. Trust me, if expiation can make it into a translation, not respect is good enough for a translation. So what happens in this first episode of humans reaching out to God?
God has a favorite child.
Okay, but notice the very first form of korban, of sacrifice that we see in the entire Torah, is not because they sinned, right? Cain and Abel are not offering a sin sacrifice here. They are offering a voluntary sacrifice, a free will. Just they want to say, hi, God, and draw closer. And apparently, sometimes it works. You read the story that it is primarily because Abel brought the firstlings of his flock, that is to say, something that was choice and good and perfect, whereas Cain brought just fruit, stuff. It's not necessarily that fruit is worse than goats. We see very clearly as Leviticus goes on that there are many vegetable type offerings. They're not all meat. So this is not a criticism of the content. It's a criticism of the quality, that one brought the best and the other brought the mediocre. And apparently, if you want to draw close to God, you kind of have to bring your best game. You bring something mediocre and you shouldn't expect positive outcomes.
So it's not,
Notice.
It's not the thought that counts in this case.
It is the thought that counts.
No.
No, because the content is being judged.
The content would be different if your thought were different,
Yeah.
right? The content reflects what was truly your thought.
But if you're giving a free will sacrifice
Mm-hmm.
and you're just picking up fruit from the ground, maybe that fell from the trees.
Right. The leftovers.
Yeah, it's basically leftovers that he's offering. All right, so that thought doesn't count.
Correct.
Okay.
Because that thought isn't, I want to connect to God with the best of me. That thought is, I guess he's doing something, I should do something too.
So he's following code.
As a possible explanation. Or he might be doing it because his parents are pushing him. Or he might be doing it because he sort of kind of thinks he wants to have this thing with God. But, you know, fruit is so tasty. Why would I give the best stuff up? Right? It may be that his thought wasn't, I'll give some, but his thought was, we'll see what happens. And anyone here who's ever tried to be in a relationship knows, is usually not the way that's going to create momentum and excitement within that relationship. You kind of have to step and give it your all and see where it goes, which was immediately reciprocated. But notice as well, Cain isn't punished because he brought a wanting sacrifice, because his sacrifice wasn't the greatest thing ever in the world. He just simply didn't get the benefit that he was hoping for, or that he might have been hoping for. But if he had truly been hoping for, he would have been willing to make the investment. And you know, that is one of those truisms we see in life, right? If you want the benefit, you have to make the investment. If you don't make the investment, you're not going to get the benefit. And don't complain about the process if you chose not to make the investment.
The Torah doesn't say how God showed his respect or non-respect.
No additional details. Yeah, I know. Frustrating sometimes, isn't it?
Yes.
The Mishnah goes into that.
There are many different attempts by midrashim and commentators to how did they know what was being accepted and what wasn't. But unfortunately, the Torah itself doesn't go in. But the book of Psalms does go into a little more detail of what God is looking for in this whole process. And this is taken from Psalm 51.
O Lord, open my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise.
Right, which, if you're not familiar with the translation, Adonai Sefatai Tiftach, right, this is the phrase that is customarily recited just before we daven the Amidah, just before we do the Avot, Giverot, and the other prayers in our services. But then the psalm continues.
For you do not delight in sacrifice, else I would give it. You take no pleasure in burnt offering. Huh?
Keep going.
The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. Do good in your favor to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of righteousness, in burnt offering and whole offering. Then they will offer bullocks upon your altar.
All right. Confusing?
Yes.
Contradictory?
Totally.
No. It's actually beautifully consistent, but it sounds contradictory, right? For you do not delight in sacrifice. What this is saying is you do not delight in sacrifice in and of itself, right? God does not get happy when a korban is offered, just the motion of the sacrifice, if you will. God is not excited when the parts are put up on the altar and turned into smoke just because parts have been put on the altar and turned up into smoke. What God does want is the proper spirit motivating the sacrifice. For example, this isn't the only example, but this is the one the psalmist chose. When someone is bringing a sin offering, they have to have a contrite spirit. They have to be coming with humility. If they don't, if they're only going through the motions of sacrifice, bringing the sheep, having it slaughtered, thrown on the thing, but yeah, whatever, God's not happy just because you brought a lamb to be killed. God only wants the sacrifice if it represents the real feeling and thought that you're supposed to have. Which is why once the walls have been rebuilt and the people have been gathered and they're living better, then they will be offering sacrifices out of joy, out of righteousness, out of goodness, and God's going to be perfectly fine with those. So the great mistake of the ancient world was to believe that there was something intrinsic to the motion, the physical act of slaughtering the animal and turning it into smoke, that was of positive benefit to God, or at least in a way that would manipulate the divine energy that would bring me positive benefit, regardless of my own spiritual state. And what the psalmist is saying here, and also by extension, at least most interpretations of Cain and Abel, is that's not how it works. It's not about sticking something in the slot marked sacrifice and then receiving something out of the other slot marked spiritual benefit. It's not about insert animal here. It is about insert your spirit here through the act of the animal and the rest. How are we doing with that? What do we think?
Well, it's trying to differentiate between the old idolatrous sacrifices, which were for not expiation, but I had the word and lost it already. Trying to change God's
Manipulation.
mind. Manipulation.
Transactional.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Bring me riches, whatever else.
Exactly. I'll give you 3 sheep if you give me a good crop.
Yeah.
It's very transactional rather than relational. Right? Are you looking through the interaction with God? Are you looking for the payoff? Are you going to work the system to make sure you give the minimum amount of input in order to get the maximum output? Or are you coming to this as a relationship and saying, I want to give my best in order that I will have the relationship, which, yes, will have as a side effect all sorts of benefits, but it's the relationship itself that I want. And again, only because so many of the prophets and so much of life is directed this way, it's like a good marriage, right? Am I in the marriage because of what I get out? And you can have a transactional relationship like that, right? You know, this person is going to be paying the bills, this person will be taking out the trash. And, you know, we're both happy with that arrangement because it fits the needs of each other. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as both partners know that that's what kind of relationship you're in. But both within our tradition as well as within general culture, we tend to elevate a relationship where I'm not in it for what I get out of it. I'm in it because there is something beautiful in the relationship itself, even though I know that, yes, there will be benefits that come to me because of having that relationship. And that's what God in the Psalm here is trying to drive home, and which Abarbanel is going to try and make even more clear for us in his commentary.
The knowledge of the sacrifices, despite it being explained in the verses of the Torah, are hidden from us today, since it is not practiced and the service has been lost with the destruction of our temple and glory.
Which he's making a very astute cultural observation for someone who lived in the 15th and 16th century, which is we can't really feel what the sacrifices were because in his life it had been 1,500 years since they'd offered, and for us it's been 2,000 years since we offered sacrifices. And so it's hard for us to really understand them. It doesn't matter that the Torah is written very clearly and we can see how they were done. It's hard for us to make that leap of connection to know what they felt like. But he's going to try to help us get there anyway.
They are named korban for 2 reasons. One, it is offered, the korban,
right,
upon the altar.
Which, as you can see, is the same root word, right? The kuf resh bet.
And 2, It creates great closeness between the one bringing it and God. And this is, as it is stated in Deuteronomy, and who is likewise a great nation God has so close to them.
That has
That
God,
has-
yeah.
Yeah. Who is likewise a great nation that has God so close to them.
Right. So what he's trying to say is that, yes, there is an offering element, and that element is not maybe lost to us, but it's harder for us to fully conceptualize because we're so distant from when sacrifices were offered that we've lost much of that emotional touchstone. But we can definitely appreciate the other aspect of sacrifices, which is of a building of a closeness between ourselves and God. And that we may have different tools for. We may seek that closeness through prayer. We may seek that closeness through study, which is why you're here. We may seek that closeness through the performance of the commandments. And so that we should find at least a somewhat comparable understanding, something that we can relate to. Make sense? Okay. Now, for the final section here, which goes on for some length, this is actually from Shadal, and a great commentator of the more modern ilk, who tries to really pull apart what's going on in this whole process. So,
The korbanot were originally not commanded, but from God's initiative, to thank God for his kindness, or to bring a present to try to make him forget his anger, and to appease him so that he would fulfill their requests.
right? So originally he's hypothesizing it wasn't that God commanded sacrifices because God wanted sacrifices. Man wanted a way to thank God, to appease anger, or to try and fulfill a request. God wanted something to be done. And God said, all right, if you want something to do, here, do this. Which you could conceive of, if you've ever had a friend who has a birthday party or a birthday coming up, and you say, what do you want for your birthday? And they'll tell you, oh, nothing, right? And you go, no, I want to give you something. Well, I suppose, there's a new book by such and such an author that's coming out.
Yeah.
If you have to give me something, you could do that. So that's what he's saying the sacrifices were, is that humanity wanted something to do. And this was God structuring what we did so we didn't end up worshiping golden calves and doing other things that were.
And that's also, Abraham comes back and, well, this is what your father Abraham did.
Right.
And so like he did,
Right.
you can have the same opportunity.
Exactly, with some different guidelines. So
Yeah.
we don't actually cut the animal in half and walk between it and
Right.
such, but we do have similarities.
Similarities.
Exactly, that would make it seem historically important to us too. All right, but he goes on.
For it is only appropriate for a person to relate to his God as he relates to a flesh and blood king. And their stratagem in offering the korban was to burn it and thus take it from their own possession and the possession of all other humans, animals, and birds. And also, as it is burnt and its smoke ascends skyward, it appears to them as if it ascended to God.
Right, so how do you know that you've given it to God? Because you've taken it away from your own possession completely. And to do it in a way that symbolizes, a connection to the ethereal, that which is intangible, by turning it into smoke, all the better. But yes.
So these carbonot were not eaten by the body.
These particular ones were not. Now, some of them are, right? So the olav was not eaten. Other ones did have pieces that were eaten. Excuse me. But there was a general feeling that in those cases, it wasn't the person offering that was eating it, and therefore it was still being given away. But that brings me right back to that middle sentence there. For it is only appropriate for a person to relate to his God as he relates to a flesh and blood king. That may seem weird to us, lovely modern Americans who live in our democracy and have done for more than 200 years without a king. But the standard behavior when you go to visit the king is you bring the king a gift. Yeah, I know. What do we Americans know?
Yeah.
Right.
He has everything and I have none.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and I bring him something.
Yes, you do, right? Because by bringing him something, you are showing yourself to be in a position of subservience, in a position of humility, and a position of supplicant, right? And that is what it is. And in many cultures, even to this day, not as many as it used to be, People, when they went to see an important guy in the town, or if they're going to go visit somebody of whom they're going to ask a favor, you know, think Godfather kind of thing, they're going to bring something, right? It may be a little something. It may just be, you know, my wife baked these cupcakes for you, Godfather, or it may be something, you know, oh, well, you know, I happen to have this extra stallion that I don't need, and I was wondering if you might be interested in having it, so that you're, you know, making it as a gentle gift rather than a bribe. That was a very standard way of relating to people in power. In fact, it is such a standard way of relating to people in power that that is exactly the terminology that's used when Jacob is approaching Esau. When he is sending all of those gifts, he does it for kapara, right? Which again, we can say is atonement and expiation, or we can say was to smooth out that relationship. And the weaker person in the relationship is the one who's responsible for the smoothing, right? That was where Jacob was. And even if Jacob didn't have reason to believe that Esau thought he was guilty of something, he certainly, from simply being the weaker person in that relationship, would have, by ancient culture and almost all the way up into the modern world culture, have been the one responsible for making the gesture of smoothing out the relationship, of appeasing the relationship. Question, comment, just shifting your hand.
No, I was thinking of when President Obama went to see the Queen the first time.
Mhm. Queen of England, I'm
The
assuming.
Queen of
Yeah.
England. And his wife gave him a bad time because he gave the Queen of England an iPod. You know, it's like, who gives the Queen an iPod?
Couldn't she buy her own?
Or, and
And that's our lovely American attitude, right?
But,
But-
it's
But culturally and more in broader other cultures, which I wouldn't be surprised if Obama had learned when he lived in Indonesia and other places,
that
when you visit someone of importance, you give them something, not,
well, countries do that.
Yeah.
Heads of state do that.
absolutely. I mean, heads of state, I mean, that's still because diplomacy is still so codified in history. They still follow many of these practices, which is, you know, if some, you know, small country is visiting the president of the United States, even if they're a very poor country, they're going to bring a gift, even if they're asking for us to help them. And it's like, well, couldn't you keep your gift and then we don't have to help you as much? No, that's not how it's done, right? The weaker party brings something to show that they want to establish the connection.
That's why, excuse me, it was set up that every time somebody comes to visit the president, they got to list the gift
Exactly right.
that was brought to them.
And-
Regardless of what it is, they have to keep track.
And that is also precisely in the modern world to avoid corruption and bribery. Whereas in the ancient world, that was a perk of being king, was you got all the gifts. Nowadays, yes, they make sure that the individual politicians, whether it be president or senator or anyone, is not able to keep a gift that is brought more symbolically than ever, precisely for that reason. Yes. All right, Shadal goes on.
The divine Torah, whose purpose is not to teach the nation wisdom and knowledge, but rather to direct them in the path of righteousness, did not nullify the practice of sacrifices, not that it was in its power to do so, but rather that this custom was not bad from any aspect of itself and was not harmful for people and for fixing their traits, but rather it helped them.
So this is a gentleman who would have benefited from a period every now and then, because that was a really long sentence with lots of negatives scattered throughout it. But let's make sure we got, but the gist of what he's trying to say, which is when the Torah left sacrifices as an institution in, it's not because the Torah was too weak to prohibit them. If God had wanted to get rid of sacrifices because they were inherently bad, God would have gotten rid of sacrifices because they were inherently bad. He got rid of murder, he got rid of theft, he got rid of adultery. God had no problem prohibiting stuff. But sacrifices he left in. Why? Because there is an aspect of them that can be very good at fixing our traits, at helping guide us. And if done properly, they are a worthy activity. That if there was the important word, and that's where Psalm 51 continues, hopefully to be echoing in the back of your mind, that if a sacrifice is done improperly, not in terms of violating the mechanics, but of violating the spirit, then it is a pointless endeavor, or perhaps even a negative action. But if done properly, it can be a very beneficial thing, which he'll go on to continue to explain.
Since one of the foundations of the Torah is the faith that God supervises the actions of mankind and loves those who do good and hates the wicked, it is of necessity that God not be depicted in the absolute supremacy according to his true level, but rather it is as if his greatness is lowered a bit, and he is depicted in the conception of mankind like a great king who understands all their actions, hears their cries, and accepts their gifts.
Right. So what Shadal is saying here is actually very, very radical. He's saying God is so infinite. God is so beyond our conception of humanity that if you really made people think of God like that, they would have no way to relate. They'd have no way to connect. It would just be God is, I don't know, so I'll go do this instead. So instead, God says, look, if you want to treat me like a king, because that's how your spirit moves you, that's what you think you should be doing, because that's how you treat the people that you respect the most, then okay, we'll set up a system where you can treat me like that. It doesn't mean I am, low enough to be acting like a king, but it does mean you need the boost to think of me in some way that is at least at the edge of your fingertips of grabbing for some conception of what I am. And we'll use that. We'll work with that, says God. We'll get there, but we'll keep that as a stepping point in our relationship. Make sense? Okay. See why I love Shadal. All right, onward.
And this necessity was not only in that generation, but rather in every generation equally. And if in place of the korbanot, God had commanded upon prayer, songs, and reading of the Torah and saying words of ethics, and did not command korbanot, the greatness of God and the fear of him would not be registered in the heart of the general populace, for it would appear that the requests of the other nations, whose worship involved sacrificing before them many peace offerings, were greater and more honorable than our God, whose service is only with words. Yeah.
Good analysis of human psychology, right? If God only asked us to do prayers, to sing songs, to study ethics, and to share the words of Torah, and everyone else was over there offering up an entire herd worth of oxen, whose God is more respectable, right? Whose God gets greater honor, right? As much as we might intuitively, or not intuitively, we might logically say, oh, no, our God is far superior because our God is beyond all of that. We're human. And we're still impressed by people who get out of the limousine more than the person who drives themselves to the Oscars. Aren't we?
Yeah.
Right? We're more we respect, or at least are more impressed by the people who have an entourage than we are by the people who go out by themselves. It doesn't mean it's right, but it is the way our monkey brains work. And God knows it. And therefore, God is making a concession to ensure that we do not stumble because God gives us too pure a conception of God, or demands, I should say, a too pure conception of God. Because if God were to demand only that conception, then only people like Moses and Abraham would get it. And the rest of us would go, well, our God seems kind of, chintzy, kind of paltry, because we're not doing enough. We're not doing, look at what they're doing, right? I mean, we sometimes have building envy even to this day, where we say, look at the cathedral. The cathedral's pretty impressive. How come we don't have a cathedral, right? We still have some feelings like that of where's our pyramids, right? We never built a Colosseum. And God is at least giving us this level that can help us make that connection. Make sense? All right, onward.
Since in those days, it was not possible to bring his fear into the heart of the nation without korbanot, he commanded upon them. And behold, the product of the sacrifices which the community offered in the Mikdash was this, that it registered in the heart of the general populace that God and a great king dwelled in their midst, and that they would be beloved to him, and that he commanded them services which were desired before him.
Think about, again, why does the king live in a palace? Why does the king wear fancy clothes? Why does the king ride the best horse? Why does the king have trumpeters going before him? Is it just because of his ego? Some, maybe. But for others, the pomp and the circumstances and the ritual and the glory are there to inspire the people and to make them feel that they are being cared for by something as great as that. And if the king just walked around, dressing like a schlemiel, the people might still think, oh, that's a nice king. He doesn't tax us too much and he gives us good rules, but he's not as impressive as their king. So is being ruled by a good but not flashy king really going to inspire us and fill us with a sense of thankfulness and of gratitude for being under the umbrella of this monarch? Or are we going to be envying the grandeur of the other king and think that maybe that king might be better because he's got better special effects going on, right? Got a better wardrobe department. And the korbanot are there to bridge so that we can have the mikdash, again, limited. So we don't have big statues of our king, or we're not doing, human sacrifices and doing other things that would be well beyond the pale. But it does feed our understanding that God is great by using what we consider to be great, because we're human.
Yet the korbanot of the individual are all for the sake of the individual in all the times that pass upon him. If good comes upon him, he gives thanks to God and offers his korban. And via this, it is registered in his heart that this good came to him from God, and he will trust in God and fix his actions in order to have God's love and favor continuously extend to him. And if he is in dire straits, he prays to God and vows a vow that if he lets him escape, he will offer before God a korban. And then, when he is saved, he fulfills his vow, and it is registered in his heart that God saved him. And if he sinned accidentally, he brings a korban, and it is registered in his heart that his God forgave him, and he is desired before God as he was initially.
All right, so who benefits from the sacrifices?
We do.
Right.
Individual.
It is all for the sake of the individual. God did not give us sacrifices because God wanted more doves and more sheep and more cows to be slaughtered, right? It wasn't just because God is a big fan of barbecue. God is giving us these things so that we have an opportunity when we need it most, at our high points, at our low points, when we feel that we've messed up, that we will be able to feel that we have done something that connects us to God, that smooths out that relationship, because we will not feel it if we don't have a physical activity that helps us feel it that way. And that's for us. That's our benefit, right? We may talk about the reach, the smell, as though that God is smelling in the sacrifices. But we can easily see the word reach as being connected to the word ruach, to the word of our spirit, right? Of our energy, right? It wasn't that God smelled what we had done. It was our spirit was restored by having had this opportunity, or was increased by having this opportunity. And that's what God is giving us by giving us a sacrificial service. Again, still hard as moderns, who people who have not sacrificed in 2,000 years, roughly, and now living among people who haven't done animal sacrifices for about 500 or so years, depending upon which part of the world you live in. It's still hard for us to understand how you would feel that from the slaughter of an animal, but I would be willing to bet that those of you that have ever lived on a farm or lived in an agricultural community, who know about when the important person comes, you kill the goat or you kill the sheep or you kill a chicken because you're going to have a special dinner because an important person is coming, that you would see the association between the slaughter and the important person much more easily than those of us who get our food from, Winn-Dixie. When an important person comes to your house, I mean, still to this day, I'm sure that most of you will prepare a nicer meal. You just don't see the actual that goes along with that preparation, whereas our ancestors all did. And so the slaughter was a necessary component for them to see that preparation. Make sense? Okay. Last
For-
paragraph.
For if there was no atonement for the accidental violation, the sinner would say in his heart, who will save me from this strict God? Without knowledge I sinned, and his anger is burning against me, and he will cast me from before him, and I have no hope to turn away his wrath. If so, why should I guard myself further from sinning from this day on?
Right? If I've already messed up and there's no way to fix it, then I'll just keep messing up. Right? I mean, why not?
And yet, the one who sins deliberately does not bring a korban.
Think about that for a second. If you don't remember from having read through the book of Leviticus before, there is no sacrifice brought for somebody who deliberately sinned. Right? If I say, today's Shabbat, but I'm going to go light a bonfire, and I'm doing this because I hate God. If I actually say that and then do it, and then I go the next day, you know what? That was probably a childish thing to do. There is no sacrifice that atones for that.
The commentary that I read this morning on Psalm 51, verse 19 was, that is what is required. If someone sins deliberately, they must first develop a contrite heart.
Well, and actually, yeah, exactly right. There is still tshuva. There is still repentance.
That you have to have before you can have a korban.
But there isn't a korban for
There's no
deliberate
korban.
sin. Not at all.
Right.
Right? You can still do tshuva. You can still repent. You can still change. You can still restore your relationship with God.
Sacrifice is gonna satisfy.
But you're not doing it with a sacrifice
Right.
because
And yet the one who sins deliberately does not bring a korban, in order that it not be registered in his heart, like the thoughts of the early nations, that God takes bribes from the sinners and forgives the nations for their sins.
what was one of the great criticisms of the Catholic Church that Martin Luther leveled? The indulgences, right? Which gave the impression, which obviously in Catholicism was not intended, but it was really easy for people to see it that way, that if you sinned, you could buy forgiveness. Or you could even buy it in advance. And then go, I mean, at least that's the way it felt, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to Las Vegas next week, so I better stock up. There was a feeling that was what was happening there. It was a transactional relationship in that sense. And if there was a sacrifice, even with contrition, for a deliberate sin, then it would just seem like that kind of early pagan bribing your God with food in order to secure forgiveness. And that's not what it takes to get forgiveness. What it takes is the contrite heart. All right. And then furthermore.
And yet, the one who sins deliberately.
Oh, I think we read that one. And one who. Fourth line or fifth line up.
You're right. And one who fulfills a vow to God upon the kindness that he did for him.
Meaning, like, again, if you were, in a boat that you thought was going to sink and you were saying, God, if you get me out of this, I'll bring a sacrifice.
Others as well are compelled to rejoice with him. And via this, he is joined in the bonds of love with men whom he did not know beforehand. Or at the very least, the paupers will benefit from his feast.
Right, because this is a sacrifice that would be eaten and shared as a gratitude type sacrifice. And no one can eat a whole sheep by themselves. Right? That's like one of those eating challenges. And no one can eat a sheep or a cow, for one person. So it is by necessity going to be shared with more people. And that will bind you together with other people in celebration of your good fortune, which will also make them happy for you, which, is a great way towards running down the feelings of jealousy and resentment of, well, why did he get something good and I didn't get something good? It's like, oh, I got a steak. That tends to make people a little happier when one person enjoys good fortune, when they share it around. It tends to make people overcome that resentment and bitterness that can come.
But doesn't the beginning of that sentence, and one who fulfills a vow to God upon the kindness that he did for them, doesn't that sort of seem like bribery? God, if you do this kindness to me, then I'll bring you a sheep?
Ex post facto.
Oh.
If you pray, you're sick and you pray for healing, that would be.
That, yeah.
Let me ask you this.
Okay.
If you help me get an internship somewhere, and I send you a bunch of flowers to say thank you for putting in a good word for me with that firm, or for letting me know that they were looking for someone, is that a bribe?
It depends how it was done. If you say to me, if you get me into that firm, if you get me an interview, I'll give you $150. Yeah, that's a bribe.
Well, I can see, yeah.
But after, now, if later on you say, oh, out of gratitude, this was so nice, here's that's not a bribe, that's a thanks offering. The
Right.
other way sort of does look sort of like.
I can see that, yes. And I think that may be part of the reason why this particular sacrifice is being enjoyed and shared in a broader way, right? So that your gratitude is not looking like a bribe, because it's not God that's benefiting from the sacrifice. It is the people around you that are benefiting from the sacrifice. So at least I think that's the way that there's a distinction there. But it's a good question. So sacrifices. They're still probably not easy for us to fully embrace emotionally. And I don't know if the temple was, rebuilt tomorrow and the sacrifices were started again, immediately, whether we would all be like, woohoo, or whether we like, okay, let me get my head around this. But hopefully, at least you understand the underlying ideas of what they were intended to teach, of what they were intended to make us feel, and how we can still reach for those feelings through other means. Like I said, we may only have the words that Shadal was talking about, of study, of song, of psalms, of ethics, we may only have the actions of commandments that we can do. But if we do them with the same spirit as the sacrifices, which again, we're not about diminishing, but we're about smoothing out that relationship and creating a better bond, we can still smell that sweet smell. Thank you.
Wow. When it's off, I have the opportunity, when it's off.